All right, well, we're going to get started. I will put on video for just a tiny, tiny bit. I'm Doug Crandall. As most of you know, I direct the Advancing Employment Training and TA Center here in Georgia, funded by the Georgia Council on Developmental Disabilities. I'm joined as always by Joseph Harrison, Amy Price, and Dr. Rackensberger of the Advancing Employment team. We have a special presentation today. And I'm going to turn it over to these guys. These are our friends in Wisconsin. Amy and I reached out to Shannon and Molly, and they were so gracious to share what we think is something that should be a national initiative. What they're going to talk about today, I'm not going to give it away other than what you saw in the webinar description. But we really believe that that should be part of our policy imperatives here in Georgia. For those of you who know, you can find those on the front page, I guess the second page now, since we're into NDAM, the 8 policy imperatives for Georgians with disabilities and employment. And we're really thrilled to learn from these guys today. Shannon is somebody I've known for a few years, and Shannon has worked on every major initiative you can imagine, from Medicaid infrastructure grants to Promise grants. And Molly Cooney totally does up the Employment First conference in Wisconsin. I had a great pleasure of partaking in that back in the spring of 2021, and just met Shelley, their partner with Goodwill there. So without any further ado, I want to turn it over to these guys. Again, let's give them our full attention. Just a reminder, put stuff in chat, raise your hand, but we're going to let folks kind of finish their presentation before we dive in. Welcome everybody, and happy NDAM 2022. Take it away, Wisconsin.
Thanks, Doug. I'll start my screen here. Are you seeing the right visual? Okay, great. So hi everybody from up here in Wisconsin. I love Georgia. I love Atlanta, actually. It's a great city. So super happy to be joining you today to talk about some work that we're doing up here in Wisconsin. We call it the Partners with Business Initiative. And we'll give you some history, background on the initiative, kind of where we're at, the work that we've been doing. There's a lot of detail in this, so I bet you there'll be, questions coming up in the chat that I may end up answering along the way as we talk a little bit more about the different nuances of this initiative, especially around the paid coworker supports part of the work, which gets really into nuts and bolts. We'll touch on that a little bit today, but we'll keep things fairly high level in terms of the overall initiative and how we're working on partnering with businesses to build capacity within businesses and within our supported employment service arena to get more people into competitive integrated employment. So, as Doug mentioned, I'm Shannon Webb, and I am an independent consultant here based in Wisconsin, work on a number of initiatives, and I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves real quick too. So Molly and Shelley.
Sure, I'm Molly Cooney. I work for the Wisconsin Board for People with Developmental Disabilities, and I'm also excited to be here with you all today.
And I'm Shelley Bailing. I am the Job Coach Team Leader for Goodwill Industries, North Central Wisconsin. Super excited to share our learnings as we continue our journey.
Great. So I'll turn it over to Molly to just give us a little bit of background about the Wisconsin Board for People with Developmental Disabilities and some of the work that kicked off this Partners with Business initiative.
Awesome. Thanks, Shannon. So like I said, my name is Molly, and I work for the state of Wisconsin's Developmental Disabilities Council. Every state, in case you're not aware of developmental disabilities, every state has a Developmental Disabilities Council, and we serve that role for our state up here in Wisconsin. DD councils, or developmental disabilities councils, are charged with identifying what the most pressing needs are of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families, and then identifying cost-effective and innovative strategies to try to meet those needs. And when we find strategies or approaches that work, we try to scale them up. We try to make them sustainable so that all people within the state have access to those services, strategies, or methods. And one way that we do that is we try to embed them into the already existing service systems. So that's one thing that we do. To try to get things embedded into those service systems, we do a lot of advocacy at the state level. So we work with our legislature, with the governor's office, we work with leadership and decision makers within the state agencies to make sure that they are thinking about and keeping in mind people with disabilities as they pass policies and procedures that impact all people. So we're really trying to have a statewide impact to make sure that services and supports are working for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and that they're able to contribute and participate in their lives and their communities however they see fit. And that, of course, includes competitive integrated employment. Can you switch the slide, Shannon? Thank you. So here's a little list of our past employment initiatives. I'm just going to run through these because it builds on what we're currently doing now with Partners with Business. So back in 2011, we received a Partnerships in Employment grant, the PI grant, and we called it Let's Get to Work. And this project really spearheaded a lot of the employment work that we have done since. We launched Take Your Legislator to Work in 2011, and that is where people with disabilities with jobs in the community invite their legislator to visit them on the job. They get a quick tour, meet their coworkers, talk to their supervisors. And what we're really trying to do here is build champions in the legislature who understand the contributions people with disabilities make to their communities and their workplaces. So that way they're keeping people with disabilities in mind while they're passing and working on legislation. We spearheaded our employment first efforts in our state, and we had a conference that we did every year, like Doug mentioned, which now has been absorbed by our state APSE chapter, which is pretty fantastic because that means it will continue going on and on. And then we also did a lot of small grants that we gave to organizations, communities around the state to build awareness about employment for people with disabilities. And it was actually at one of these events. It was a community conversation in Medford, Wisconsin, which is a small town in central Wisconsin, where a high school was our grantee, and they were organizing this event, and their legislator came to the event, and he got very excited about employment. So this man, Representative Edming, then helped champion through our employment first legislation, which was fantastic. We also had a service transformation initiative called Building Full Lives, where we focused our efforts on service providers who wanted to move from facility-based to community-based services. So we really worked with the willing and the interested to help make that shift. And it really helped our council better understand the complexity of this transformation. And then that takes us to Partners with Business. So coworker support, whether it's natural support or paid coworker support, has been a longstanding strategy in Dane County. And Madison, the capital of Wisconsin, is located in Dane County, to give you a little idea of where it's at. So in Dane County, they really wanted to try to build up the capacity of businesses to provide support to their employees with disabilities, whether it was through natural supports or paid coworker supports, because of some really innovative policies that got passed in Dane County in the 1990s. At that point in time, there was a long waiting list for services. And so the county created a policy where they would carry out the number of support hours a recent high school graduate had for their jobs to maintain that employment. So rather than go on the waiting list, these high school graduates who already had jobs in the community could maintain that employment and receive the services and supports they needed to maintain that. The good news is that that resulted in like 75% of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities having jobs. The challenging part was that really stretched our service provider capacity. And so this was a tool, a strategy that service providers could use to be able to serve more people with disabilities to have jobs. So back when that piece of legislation for employment first was getting championed through our legislature, a bunch of advocates were also working to get this piece of legislation called Partners with Business passed. So Shannon, can you click that slide? And so in 2017, a piece of legislation called Act 323 passed through our legislature, which requires our DD Council to expand our Partners with Business practices beyond our pilot sites that we had and in Dane County, so to really push that further. So we now each year receive funding from our state legislature, and we have to implement a training and technical assistance coaching program. So each year we put forth, we issue an RFA, we gather applications, and then we select pilot sites to work with. Pilot sites include school districts, employment service provider agencies, and also businesses. For the most part, we've worked with service providers, a couple of school districts, and this year, because we revamped things a little bit, we now have our first 2 businesses that we're working directly with. So I'm going to pass this on to Shannon to give you a little more nuts and bolts about Partners with Business. And then Shelley, one of our grantees at Goodwill, will talk about their experience implementing the strategies and scaling it up organization-wide. Over to you, Shannon.
Yeah, thanks, Molly. Just to add a couple things to what Molly was saying, we're in this era of, expansion and supported employment, kind of awareness across states, and a focus on needing to get more people into jobs and, changing policies and the way that, we're funding employment supports and prioritizing funding for employment supports. And, like Molly said, we had, back in the 90s, some very innovative policies and practices that were happening in Dane County, Wisconsin, that resulted in extremely high numbers of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in jobs, and mostly because they had employment first type policies, like really stretching those scarce public resources to cover employment supports as much as possible, really training service providers to use best practices and understand supported employment and engage employers, to develop those natural supports, and closing the front door on work centers and things like that. And what we found, so unique to Wisconsin, was, we had a lot of counties in Wisconsin with waiting lists, which I know is common across the country. And we, were one of a very early state to go into what's, called the kind of managed care model of long-term care, where we have entitlement to services for people with disabilities across our entire state. And when we were expanding that, managed care system across our state, there was a lot, as we looked at what the supported employment landscape was like in many counties, it was almost nothing, right? And where it did exist, we saw that supported employment providers were using what was called kind of old school coaching, where, it was just get a job, any job, and just apply as much, support as was needed to keep that job at the time. And, that didn't necessarily work well when you had to kind of, again, stretch those resources over, all people and increase employment. So this is what, the Partners with Business initiative, was really this, kind of like Molly said, we saw that there was this workforce shortage. We saw that policies were changing around employment. We saw people wanted jobs. We saw the potential there with employers, but we realized that a lot of service providers needed coaching on strategies and to build their capacity. And same with employers, because in some communities, they weren't familiar with hiring people with disabilities, or they, frankly, just were the kind of employer that said, we'll hire someone as long as we can have a job coach here full time. So we saw this kind of, not a lot of in between, in a lot of places in Wisconsin. And so kind of took this opportunity, to create some work around that, along with the other initiatives that Molly had mentioned. So we call, Partners with Business, it's our name here in Wisconsin, around, using those best practices in supported employment to ensure good job matches, to ensure that, we're empowering employers to directly train and supervise their employees with disabilities, not over-reliance on job coaches. Really working on workplace inclusion and natural supports, maximizing, independence to the greatest degree possible. And then, that doing all of that paves the way for us to negotiate, more formal paid coworker supports with, people who need them as an ongoing option. And so as we work with service agencies, and schools and employers across the state with these grant funds and the technical assistance that we have available, we look at their practices around, these 10 areas, finding that match, being clear about the job coach role, educating, empowering employers, and helping employers understand, how to be an inclusive employer, and so on and so forth. As you can read down the list, all of those best practices. And again, like I said, until we work on all of those things through 1 through 8, we have a lot of strategies we can use and we should be using, in 1 through 8 before we start talking about paid coworker supports with employers. It absolutely works well when it's done well, but it does rely on ensuring that 1 through 8 are taken care of. So it's intended to create paid coworker supports are intended to create this more cost-effective, less stigmatizing approach to long-term care. And it can be used in combination with formal job coaching supports. And one thing I'd like to emphasize about the paid coworker support model that we've developed here in Wisconsin is it does still rely on a supported employment provider who is there checking in every month and does what we call follow along or backup supports. So oftentimes what happens is the supported employment provider does all of their great work on the front end to ensure that the employer and the employee, are working well together and all the training needs are covered, that the employer knows how to modify things or provide those accommodations. And then, once those job coaching supports start to fade off, that's where we look to see what is left, and we can negotiate whether or not it's appropriate for a coworker to provide those, or if we can be doing some more job coaching or modifications before we fade some more and look at more natural supports or whatnot. And so the agency is still involved in checking in monthly. They are involved in actually the fiscal end of the payment to the employer, because many employers don't want to become Medicaid providers. So the agreement is between the employer and the service provider. And the service provider gets the funding, that they turn over to the employer, as well as some follow-along funding that supports their work to continue to work with the employer and check in with the supported employee. So just a quick story here about a paid coworker support situation up in northern Wisconsin. This was a young man who was exiting high school and got a job at a rural grocery store. He lives in a rural community, and the nearest service provider had to, I think, drive a good hour and a half to get to him to provide his supports. And he didn't necessarily like having a job coach around. So it made sense that, because of capacity of that agency to have to take time out of their day to drive all the way there. And also for, Brian himself, not necessarily liking to have a job coach around, to negotiate those paid coworker supports with the employer. And it worked so well that he actually ended up adding a second job at an assisted living facility, and also used paid coworker supports there, because after experiencing it with the first time, the agency just really knew it was the best match. And so they developed a job with that in mind the second time around for his second job. So, the one thing to think about when it comes to paid coworker supports is that, when we support people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, there's a whole range of people and their support needs, right? And so we know that for some people, with just a little bit of, working with their employer and a little bit of support, they will become independent really quickly on the job, right? And then there's another group of people who we know for health and safety reasons, and because of their complexities of their disability, we know that they may need more high levels of job coaching support. But what we have is a lot of people, I say, in the middle that receive intermittent job coach support. So I, started job coaching back in 1992, and or maybe it was 93 when I actually started job coaching. But I can tell you, through the years as a job coach and job developer and supervising job coaches and job developers, that there's a lot of time spent standing around, not necessarily helping the person or cueing them, prompting them to do their work. And providing that active job coaching support. Job coaching can be a really boring job when all you have to do is, provide those intermittent supports, right? And what ultimately ends up happening sometimes is we overhelp, or we become too helpful to the employer because we're doing things off to the side, or maybe we're helping the supported employee a little bit too much, because there's this expectation that we're there, right? So, this paid coworker support opportunity is really, take a look at those people that you're supporting that are in that middle group that, there's been job coaching on site. It's pretty intermittent. There's this kind of idea that the coach needs to be there. Then start asking why, right? And start analyzing that. And so what we did here in Wisconsin, what I worked on with the Partners with Business project and whatnot, was this implementing this workplace supports analysis. So what I asked the agencies that I work with to do is to take this, template, go in and, either if you the job coach can write down exactly what they're doing throughout the day, or if someone else needs to go in and observe over 2 to 3 work shifts, the supports that are happening. And, ideally, observe if someone works with multiple job coaches, to observe, multiple job coaches and how they work with the person, and identify the types of support that's needed. And so there's 3 main parts to, supports, right? There's the task completion and task quality, and that's where our systematic instruction types of supports come in. There's the social, emotional, behavior supports that job coaches often provide. And then there's health, safety, and kind of personal care related support. So there's kind of these 3 primary buckets, and each one of those maybe has different tools that we work with as job coaches to support someone. And we can start to, once we identify what those support needs are, we look around and say, what intervention is being provided right now? How long does that last? What's the nature of the support, and how long does it actually last in minutes? And then look around to see, are there any potential coworkers or supervisors in the area that could be available to support? And would it be appropriate for them to support the person with that, given the workplace dynamics and whatnot? And so what we found was when agencies use this tool, they start to really identify these opportunities where they can then maybe back up, implement some better practices, because maybe job coaches are doing things out of order, or from one another, and a person doesn't have a routine on the job. Maybe they're over helping, or maybe they haven't been developing those natural supports with coworkers to kind of pump someone up during the day when things get stressful or whatnot, like we all do with each other in the workplace. So, there might be this reliance on the job coach to provide that kind of support. So, we then can create a plan to address some of these support needs in different ways and start to increase independence. So once we do that, we can clearly identify what's would be considered above and beyond natural supports. We can really pinpoint when it happens, how long the supports happen, and the type of support that's needed. And we can then go to the employer to negotiate that. Oftentimes we find that, employers just assume the job coach should be there because that's how it started and that's how it's been going. They don't necessarily question what the job coach is doing and why. But if we can bring to them that specific information and talk with them about that and negotiate, the idea of them, a coworker or a supervisor covering those supports, then it really makes for a different conversation. And so the reimbursement for the paid coworker supports for anything above and beyond what would be considered natural supports is based on the employer's cost of the coworkers or people providing that support. Not the job coach costs, right? So it's based on the employer's cost for a person or two during that specific amount of time to cover those supports. And we look at it in the quarter hour, right? So that if someone in their 4-hour shift, say, only needs 15 minutes here, 15 minutes there, 15 minutes here, and that total support, takes an hour, we negotiate it based on providing an hour of the coworker's costs as a reimbursement to the employer. So just a quick run through, and I don't know, Doug, if you send out slides after this, but we can certainly send these slides so you can kind of see the breakdown, because this is very wordy. So this is just an example, one of the many examples that we have from Dane County over the years. And this was a woman who worked at a local community center 4 days a week, from 9 to 11:30. And so she did cleanup, things like that, and it helped with meal programs. They analyzed her, support needs on the job, and they determined that, rather than have the job coach there for 2.5 hours, she really only needed 30 to 45 minutes of support during her shift. And so her support needs ranged from, the job completion stuff, and also moving on, from one task to the other, as well as some things to monitor her health, right? And so the agency approached the community center about providing those supports, and they agreed. And so you can see the cost difference. The staff time in the traditional agency support and the total cost it was needed to provide her with the support she needed. And then when we flip that over to coworker supports, it is far less expensive. And the supported employment agency, as you can see, is still involved in providing that follow along, which could be, a stop in or two a month, depending on the situation, to check in about how the agency is doing, or the employer is doing. So we have a bunch of templates and things like this available on the Partners with Business page of the Wisconsin Board for People with Developmental Disabilities website. So through this work over the years, we have developed, and I should say, FAQs around background checks. So that's one piece of this shorter version of this presentation that I didn't include, is that because there's the pass through of the Medicaid money to the employer, and these are people who are providing formalized supports that are being reimbursed by Medicaid. The people providing those supports that are written into the coworker support plan, the paid coworker support plan, not the natural supports plan, do need to pass background checks. So there's, early on, there was this concern about how do we handle that with an employer? How do we know, what to share and all that kind of stuff. So there's an FAQ on doing that. There's a coworker support plan template. There's a paid coworker agreement template, employer invoice template, and then coworker training slides. So, because the idea is that we then, as maybe there's turnover at the business or whatnot, we may need to identify new coworkers and train them up on how to provide these supports. And just before I move on to some legislative report stuff, just to show you some numbers about the work that we've been doing in this area, we have our systems in Wisconsin. So our long-term care system includes paid coworker supports as an option within our supported employment service definition in our waiver, and our Division of Vocational Rehabilitation. At the early on in the pandemic, seeing how it was needed, perhaps at the front end of employment for paid coworker supports, because employers didn't want job coaches necessarily, in their place of business during the pandemic. They adopted policies to then bring the option of paid coworker supports into the front end of employment too. So we have both sides of our service system that have this written into how we provide services. So just quickly, I don't know, Molly, if you want to, touch on any of these slides, since this is kind of the more of the DD Council end of things, but we because we received a small amount of money to provide to businesses and to provide that in agencies and schools and to provide that technical assistance, we are then accountable to provide some data on the outcomes to our legislature. So we do an annual legislative report on this work. Our numbers are small in terms of the the actual numbers of people we track in the pilot around this work, but you can see that the impact, if scaled up across more agencies as we continue to do this work, will have a greater impact. So I don't know, Molly, if you want to touch on any of this, or.
I think you did a good job, Shannon.
Yeah, so if you get these slides and you want to see what some of the outcomes are, but we do have to track, the number of Medicaid funded job coach support hours, and the reduction of those over time. So you can just kind of see visually where the reductions are year over year right now for the last 3 years, resulting in pretty significant decreases per person.
And just one thing, Shannon, is I think most of these people did not have paid coworker supports. This was
Yeah.
simply by utilizing good supported employment strategies, we were able to reduce the amount of job coaching needed. In general.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that. That's an important piece to understand, is because we make sure that we're working with agencies and businesses, on that front end to implement those best practices and really analyze what's going on job sites. We see that by the time we get to the point where we could be negotiating paid coworker supports, perhaps, maybe the supports have all faded to natural supports, right? In terms of the job coach supports, or we go to the business, then the agency will go to the business, say, hey, we've more or less faded everything. There's just this little bit here and there that's needed. And employers will say, oh, wow, if it's just that, don't worry. We understand, get your job coach out of here. We can cover the rest, so that's what we've seen. There's actually been very few instances of needing to go to paid coworker supports in the Partners with Business initiative, because the agencies are doing so awesome and just really working on those best practices. So with that, I'm going to end my part, but I'm going to segue into the Goodwill story, because this is hot off the presses. We just finished up a video that features some of the work that they did with one person who works at Panera, and just talking about their capacity building efforts. And then Shelley will go into, providing more details about what they've been doing.
The Wisconsin Partners with Business initiative provides grants to supported employment agencies, schools, and businesses to use best practices that empower employees with disabilities to achieve greater independence at work. Facing wait lists due to job coach workforce shortages, Goodwill Industries of North Central Wisconsin used their Partners with Business grant to strategically reduce job coaching and increase employer-provided supports.
And once we started getting into what the tools with Partners with Business looked like, we really determined and realized that this was just best practice. Focusing on job coach competencies and building natural supports with employers, for us, has been a large part of our answer to creating more capacity for services, because we've become more effective and more efficient at what we do. So much of our team has been hungry for these tools because we want to make sure we're making the most positive impact as possible. So giving people the tools to do that has really helped us shift, and that's really moved our capacity, so much so that our wait list has been cut in half. Well, Lewis is actually a great example of an initial win that we've had, because he's been on our caseload since about 2016. He's been at his place of employment for 5 years.
When I work at Panera, I clean the tables, put the dishes back in the dish area, take care of some bubblers, wipe down the tables, and probably be do a little bit of cleaning and mopping up the floor.
Goodwill did an analysis of their job sites to identify locations where they could engage employers to provide more support, thereby reducing or eliminating job coach time.
We chose to try to work on fading job coaching with Lewis because we knew he could do it. We've always seen the potential in him. We were really able to ramp things up once we started working with the Partners with Business model. We started having conversations with Panera right away, and they were on board. They wanted to see that Lewis could work as independently as possible. They thought it would be a bonus to have one less person, a job coach, around their dining room during their busy times.
And then we went to having a job coach 4 days a week to 2 days a week. And then once we realized he didn't really need that job coach, we just pulled the plug. He's been doing very good ever since.
To develop more natural supports at Panera, we helped Panera and Lewis really understand that they needed to talk directly to each other and not always go through a job coach or a case manager.
We've provided resources to employers and also re-established what our role is with them, so they know right off the bat that we're really trying to create that relationship versus being the middleman for them between the person and their employee and them.
Coworkers support Lewis any way they can. They're really good about, hey, did you get vacuuming done yet? And he just gets right back to it. And so everybody kind of holds each other accountable at night. And so it's a really cool environment.
My boss helps me at work by reminding myself to do my job. I like about my job at Panera Bread is easy to make some new friends, meet new people.
Being able to fade job coaching has really helped Lewis be more independent at work. It's helped him feel like more a part of the team and not being different from his other coworkers by having someone else following him around. He really is embraced by his team. I think not having a job coach has really helped that.
To build capacity, Goodwill launched an organization-wide effort to transform how they approach supported employment. They pulled together a team to decide what to focus on first. The team included leaders and, probably most importantly, direct support professionals, job coaches, and case managers.
We focused on 2 different competencies to make movement in our capacity. So the first one was systematic instruction. We wanted to make sure we were coaching consistently and effectively. And then building natural supports was big too. That's another competency that we really wanted to focus on. I think that Lewis's success story too is a great example of how this has impacted our team. Lewis works primarily night and weekend shifts, which are a little bit more difficult to cover with staffing. And it has created not only a great celebration for him, because he can own his independence and really own his job, but it's also created some room for our team and our staff, and shifts that were difficult to cover now don't exist because that person is independent, or they exist for a shorter amount of time because we're working more effectively or more efficiently to help people become independent. During job coaching shifts, we've also implemented a way for job coaches to do some self-evaluation and a little bit of self-check. Are you jumping in right away when someone needs help? Are you jumping in to ask the employer what's next? We want to empower the person to be communicating with their employer in that way versus job coaches doing that. Seeing the people who have had job coaching for a while and maybe just needed a little bit of support here and there, being able to impact them in this way and for them to be able to celebrate that they're independent in this way has been really cool.
I think the biggest thing is just to remember that everybody learns different and everybody needs something else. And just because somebody has a disability, it doesn't mean that they're not going to be as good of an employee, because Lewis is a great employee and he is just as much part of my team as anybody else. It's just about what does that person need and how can you get there for them.
Yeah, so just to add 2 more details before Shelley takes off, takes the rest of the show here is, in terms of grants, the providers only get $5,000. I just want to make sure that that's clear. That's the size of the mini grants that we have here in Wisconsin. So it's not like they're, receiving a lot of money or whatnot to try to work on this. And what I also, just to, kind of provide a little background too, is that when we start working with them on the initiative, and this is why the numbers in the legislative report are so small, is we actually only ask them to identify at the beginning 2 to 3 people that they would, really do that analysis with and focus in on, decreasing supports and looking at the option of paid coworker supports, so that way it doesn't feel so overwhelming. But Goodwill, just after they started doing that analysis with a couple of people, realized this is something we have to do across the board, right? And so with that, I'll hand it over to Shelley to talk more.
Thanks, Shannon. So as Shannon mentioned, when we take a look at how we're moving through the processes and guiding employers to be good partners with business, we also realized, gosh, we need to take a look at ourselves and make sure we're going to be a good partner in business for anyone that we have in our place of employment. So our journey began with improving service delivery and job coaching consistency to bolster the goal attainment. We wanted to strengthen our employer relations and create a role that was consistent between a case manager and an employment specialist. So we have different roles in our environment here at Goodwill, and we wanted to make sure that those roles were communicated very, very clearly. And then we wanted to utilize the organizational wide structure to increase service capacity and retain our job coaches through better training and career pathing. So in a tough employment world, we have to set ourselves apart and make sure people want to be a job coach and understand why they want to be a job coach and how that can impact and others along the way through our own services. So that's where we started our journey. This quote here on the left, sorry, Shannon, is something that we keep in mind as we were going through this journey, because we didn't know where to start. So we didn't have a plan. And you really want to have a plan and you want it laid out and you want it perfect and everything's going to work well. We didn't have a plan for this. We just decided to jump in and make changes along the way and be better and better and better and create a better environment for the future. So don't be afraid to jump in without having a perfect plan, is the gist of that. First thing we did is we have a job coach self-evaluation tool. Kayla mentioned this a little bit in the video, but this is about taking a look at a job coach site that you're at as a coach and answering these questions. It really brought about an understanding for some of our coaches, like, wow, am I really missing out on this opportunity here? I'm really doing these things. I need to scale back. I need to shift my attention to be somewhere to help develop the individual rather than just making it easy in the moment. So we implemented this. All of our job coaches filled this out, and then we had great group discussions on these to help attain some better conversations about why we're doing what we're doing and how we can avoid doing that in the future, and who's doing it well, and share those good best practices. So we did this on an annual basis, and we're up for our next evaluation of this with our job coaches. So I can't wait to see how it comes to play.
And just to credit, this is an fairly old ICI tool, Institute for Community Inclusion. I think you guys tweaked it some, but this has been out there for a while, so some of you may recognize it.
In addition to having the self-evaluation tool, at the same time, Goodwill was also going through a structure change with how we were case noting and doing our job development. We had gone from a pure paper system to a complete electronic. So we went from the Volkswagen to the Cadillac, and we had implemented the system. And in doing so, we were able to take the levels of systematic instruction and actually put that right into our job coaching case notes. So this is an example of a case note. Basically, job, the service provided is the job coaching. Level of prompting, we're able to choose one of these levels of prompting, the time that they're in that level, if it was meeting a goal or not, and then a general description of the interaction throughout the day. This has allowed us to then take that high level approach and say, hey, during this amount of time, we're using only this prompt. And then we're able to allow that to happen maybe with more natural support than it is anything else, because it's such a so closely related to what they're doing. So here's our tool that we're using now to be able to evaluate our interactions and see where we can continue to adjust to fading or to complete partners with business. In addition, we also wanted to clarify and strengthen our roles. And so we developed, from an employer perspective, a couple of different things. One, we had a one-page outline, which talks about the different roles and Goodwill's commitment to the employers. Then we also developed a 1-hour training for employers to watch on working with people with all abilities. And we also have an informal training. And then lastly, we have our workplace inclusion checklist. So our one-pager looks like this. So we have our job coach role, we have the case manager role, and then we have the job developer. Sometimes with employers, we're starting actually with the job developer being the first touch to that employer. Other times it might be the case manager and then the job developer. But in any case, the employer can clearly see what the expectations are, and it really helps to keep our lines very clear between each of the 3 roles. Next, this is the job coach evaluation. Okay, there we go. So the 1-hour training, it's working with people with all abilities. We basically send them a link and they can choose to use it as the employer however they want. Maybe it's just with their management team. Maybe it's with their whole team. But with it being a link, it's really allowing them flexibility to be able to learn this on their own and become a stronger employer with their inclusion. And it's also helping if they decide to share it with the entire team, helping them to see how it can benefit the entire team with their inclusions. During the video, we talk about different things from challenging and empowering individuals, learning styles, and then lastly, if there are any special accommodations that need to be made. The other part of employee relations is we wanted to make sure that employers really understood what and who the employee was that was coming to them. So we created this information sheet to basically help them feel like they were becoming part of the team right away. So highlighting some of their hobbies and interests, what they can bring to the team. So the individual kind of tells a little bit about themselves, what they hope to do during their employment and how they hope to grow. And then anything that they may need for a successful learning style. Maybe they need a lot of visual prompts, maybe they need hand over hand demonstration to learn first and then can take it from there. But all of this is provided to the employer on their first day. So they really know how to engage with that individual rather than kind of sometimes learning those things as they move along. Then lastly, we have our workplace inclusion checklist. This is something that we're working on. Our plan isn't perfect yet, but using this with our employers and making sure that they see that they have an inclusive environment and how we can support them and say, hey, you guys are already doing this. So let's make sure that we continue with this last phase of it, which is bringing that individual on to be part of your team and inclusive of your team without coaching, and how we can do that through these different avenues. So the workplace checklist is evolving and finding different ways and better ways to use it as we move through the different areas with our employer that we have that are currently working through the process. In doing all of this, we also realized that we needed to take a look at our own structure. And in doing that, job coaches were hard to find, and many of us work very hard trying to find job coaches, but we also had an opportunity where maybe we didn't have a good career plan. Maybe we didn't have a good onboarding system. So we developed these 3 areas, which was the onboarding system for job coaches. We wanted to make sure that it was strong, that our coach that we interviewed, from the minute we interviewed them to bringing them on board, felt like they were totally a part of our team and engaged and welcomed. Sometimes during interviewing, we learned that we had a candidate that might have been maybe overqualified for a job coach, but not necessarily ready to be in the case management field. So we created this middle of the road position called an assistant case manager, and they do a little bit of case management, more with our long-term support individuals. And then they do a little bit of coaching on a regular basis. So they have a balance of both worlds. And it has really allowed us to be able to support people who weren't quite ready to develop right into that case manager position. And then we also, in doing that, had to restructure our own career pathing and have created a clear path for individuals across the organization to be able to see how they can grow as an individual. So we were encouraging best practices in our service delivery. We had staff collaboration, and we also wanted to make sure we had staff retention and growth. So here's what we looked at when we created our career pathing. So we've gone from a job coach, senior job coach, assistant case manager to case managers, whether that's in our own world or another piece of our business, which is our financial and debt solutions area. So they also have case managers. And then we also have program specialists that manage programs, or our career navigators that manage the individuals working in our stores to help them have career pathways. So our retail outlets have this same type of career pathing as well. And then we have our leaders, our program leaders, and then our senior program leaders and beyond. All right. What questions does anyone have about any of the processes either that we have or anything for Shannon and Molly?
Yeah, what's in the chat? I hadn't looked.
I didn't.
Well, you're getting all kinds of kudos in the chat, and I have many questions, but I'm gonna be quiet and let folks unmute. I just want to say, and I put this in chat as well, guys, one of the best presentations on a webinar I've ever seen. So we've learned from you there, not just the content, but just astounded by all of your hard work. Questions? Everybody's giving you kudos. Any questions?
I have a question. Can you hear me? I have a new headset on.
Yes, Amy, go for it.
Sound like you're in a wind tunnel.
Oh, do I? Oh, I'm in a coffee shop, so I'm gonna be quick. So I've more lately than in the past, I've had a lot of employers say to me, like, are there any grants to pay the employees? Which is, I'm like, oh no, and that's just been coming up. But you know, one of the questions I had as I was listening to y'all today is that, you know, how do you ensure that employers aren't seeing this money that they're getting is money for the employee or the person with a disability, but really an opportunity to support job coaches, their staff to be job coaches and get training and get support, and make sure that it's framed in a way that ensures that that person is being valued as an employee and not. And so I would love, I don't know if this is something you've experienced, but this was something that was coming to mind for me, especially since lately I've been having employers asking me this question, which for me, it comes from a place of like, you know, you're seeing them in disability world and not supporting them as a valid employee of your agency. So I would love to hear if you experience this or any thoughts you have around some of that.
Yeah, as a former job developer, I can say that I've, you know, encountered employers that automatically say, that's great, but who's going to pay the person? You know what I mean? Like, I'm not willing to do that. And so, you know, I get curious about that and start asking why. Do you know what I mean? Like, maybe they're just not hiring at the moment. And then you identify, do they have other needs or whatnot? You know, you start learning why they think that they can't hire someone, you know, outright, right? And so I think that's where that kind of, you know, working up front to, you know, ensure it's a good job match, you know, empower them and educate the employer, help them understand if they've never, you know, there's very few employers that bring that up that are ill-intended, you know, to have ill intent. I think they're just oftentimes don't understand, they've never experienced this before, and they've maybe heard that there are programs that help, but they don't know what that funding looks like. And so when I coach people on talking about paid coworker supports with employers, I'm always saying it's one tool that you can mention as part of your toolbox, but it's not something you don't use it as a sell tactic, right? Unless an employer, of course, says, you know, I've done that before. We can't have job coaches in here. Do you know what I mean? Like if it's, you know, because I mean, I have worked with employers that say we have a high security environment. We've had agencies where it's a new job coach every other week, and we're just not going to do that anymore. Then it would be like, well, guess what? We have this other option. You know, so, you know, again, it goes back to utilizing those best practices. Some of you may be very familiar with, you know, the 7-phase sequence, Michael Callahan's paper of decades ago. You know what I mean? That's what this is all about, is engaging an employer to understand their role and how to provide, you know, that this is their employee, that it's a valued employee, that, you know, what are your training methods? I'm going to support you. That's why we're with Goodwill, with their 1-page thing, they say reinforces the employer provided training, you know, right. So it's really setting out the expectations from the very beginning. But if employers come to you and say, well, is there grants to pay for, you know, just start asking and having a conversation, and also sharing with the employer that no, you know, that there's no worries about hiring people with disabilities, you know what I mean, from the there a lot of times it's insurance, or maybe they have a very limited concept of what developmental disability is, and don't understand how all people can bring value to the workplace, right? And making that match and all of that. So really trying to kind of peel that away with an employer first to understand why they're asking for money to hire someone, right? And then try to, frame that conversation in all those ways of whether it's customizing a job or, providing some additional supports, or, could be that some voc rehab programs do paid work experiences from the outset. So, we can try it, VR can pay for it for, a few weeks. And if it's working out great, then we can transition to, the person to your payroll. So there are some incentives, that we can talk about with employers that are financial, but so anyway, I could spend a whole hour talking with you about just that issue. But I don't know if that helps at all. And Shelley, you can also chime in.
That I really was curious about is that, like, making sure that, like, I think you touched on a little bit, that people aren't getting confused, like who this money is for and what it's for, and that that piece.
Yep. Clarifying those roles is really important. Again, like you heard in the Panera video, and so many situations where sometimes, employers have just we've unfortunately in support employment sometimes conditioned employers to not even talk to the person that they've hired.
Right. Well, and I think, guys, that's what's so powerful about your work is we're getting back to the true intent of supported employment.
Yeah.
It was never supposed to be placement, was always supposed to be about working with employers and those natural supports. But Shannon, as you say, we have really done a great job of watering all those powerful tools down. And this returns us to that, to the true spirit of WIOA as well. I see we're losing a few folks. It must be an afternoon that's kind of busy. As you all know, this is Innovation Week for Georgia in NDEAM 2022. And I can't think of a better way to learn about information than from Shannon, Molly, and Shelley. So our deepest thanks to the three of you for taking your time. We've got a little gift we'll send you if you'll give Joseph your mailing address, but we just want to thank you. And just for some of you that are on who have RSVP'd for the Carter Center event, that's Thursday from 9:30 to noon, and we're looking forward to seeing you. Thank you again, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.